Everyone doing this afternoon? I would like to go ahead and call the joint meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee and the Coles Fair and Farmers Market Committee to order. We have the Phase 2 presentation of the Fairgrounds Master Plan this afternoon, and we will follow the same format and protocol that we established at the Phase 1 presentation on last Thursday. I will turn the floor over to Ms. Ann Hammonds, and she's going to do a brief introduction of our panel of presenters today. And after that, we will have questions and questions from the council members. Then we will also have just brief comments by the Executive Director, Mr. Buck Dozier of the Fairgrounds. And Tim, did you want to make any comments? All right. And also, my colleague and co-chair of today's meeting, Councilman Pridemore, will have some time to give some brief comments toward the end as well. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Ms. Hammonds.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to sort of remind everyone of how we got here, in February of 2011, the Council adopted BL 2010-820, directing the Fair Board and the Parks Department and the Planning Department to develop a master plan for the future of the state fairgrounds. The master plan was to include a park and the restoration of Browns Creek, modification to or removal of existing facilities, planned development for mixed-use purposes, and suggested infrastructure improvements on and off-site. We found out pretty quickly that we needed to break your request down into two phases to use two sets of consultant skills. And so you will recall that Phase 1 was presented last week. It was a technical analysis of using the fairgrounds site or an alternative site for fair and event uses. Bill Kruger of Convention Sports and Leisure presented that to you last Thursday. Now this afternoon you will hear the Phase 2 consultant team, which was directed by the council ordinance to develop a recommended mixed-use master plan for the fairgrounds site. The Phase 2 team is led by John Haas of Edge Planning and Landscape Architecture, in the center of your panel here, and John will introduce his associates. The Phase 2 team has performed the technical analysis for a market-supportable mixed-use development on the site, and will conclude with the economic comparison between Phase 1 and Phase 2. So you'll have all the information in a fairly easy to digest matrix. Just so there's no confusion, both Phase 1 and Phase 2 are technical studies. They're based on what the market will support, what the 117-acre site will support, and what will be generally compatible with the surrounding neighborhoods and businesses. Both studies conclude with projections of the economic and fiscal results of each development scenario. We hope you're going to find the information useful. Each study is driven by data rather than by taking the political pulse of the community. It is, we think, in the Metro Council that the political factors can be best weighed in light of the information about projected economic consequences that you'll be presented. So thank you very much, and John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ann. And thank you all for being here today. As many of you know, we've been working on the project now for a period of about 9 months. We've been strategically trailing the Phase 1 team, mostly because some of the information they were gathering was driving information that we will present to you today, particularly in regards to the comparison. And we've been working with the Phase 1 team throughout, most notably when we reached the comparison. We wanted to make sure we were using the same modeling techniques, same economic data, so we could truly get as close to possible as an apples-to-apples comparison. So today what we want to talk about, really, I'm going to introduce my team here in just a moment. We want to go over the objectives real quick just so you can understand what we took as our objectives moving through the project, look at our due diligence from a planning perspective, our market demand study, how that evolved into a site development program specifically for the fairground site, and then the master plan and the economic impact of that master plan. And lastly, we'll talk about that Phase 1 and Phase 2 comparison. And again, that's close to an apples-to-apples comparison as we could. To my right is Waddell Wright. Waddell is with RDG Investments. He worked closely with Pamela Yonkin, who's on my left from HDR Decision Economics, on the market demand study, as well as sort of supporting tax assessment data, property value data. Waddell was our local expert on the ground in terms of market, and Pamela was involved on the larger search in terms of demand from a market perspective. And then Clint Genoble, to my far left, is a senior associate with Edge and assisted throughout the document. So as Pam said, we approach this project as an evidence-based programming, what we call evidence-based programming. In the private development world, there are a couple of different types of developers. There are speculative developers that will essentially look at a piece of land, maybe examine the yield on that land, and move forward with a projected program. The second type of developer will do that, and in addition to that, will study the market to see what the demand is and react to that market before programming his site. That was our approach here on the Fairgrounds site. We approached this entire program as if we were looking at it from a private developer's perspective in terms of site analysis, market demand analysis, neighborhood input, and so on. We did that specifically for a mix of uses that included residential, commercial, office, institutional, light industrial, and park uses. The second part that we were asked to do, as was mentioned, is to compare the highest and best mixed-use scenario master plan with the best practices master plan from phase one that was presented to you last Thursday. So we began with our planning due diligence, which started with a review of existing documents. As many of you are aware, the Fairgrounds site has been the subject of intense study throughout the years. We began with a review of at least 9 documents, from community plans all the way to Nashville Civic Design Center's Fairgrounds studies, a ULI Rose report, all reports which had stakeholder input throughout, as well as information to do with transit, the opportunities and constraints on the site. So we reviewed those documents to begin with. In addition to that, we had stakeholder interviews. These were private interviews with folks from the public sector, also private development sector. So we talked to private developers from NAIOP, ULI, neighborhood leaders, and CSX Railroad. And then we also had some additional data collection from an economic perspective from some published sources, which I'll allow Pamela to get into here in just a moment. We also had an additional public meeting on October 1st of 2012, I should say, which was aimed at if the site was going to be mixed uses, what type of character, what type of intensity uses might you like to see, and we gathered input in that direction. So to begin with, we began to look at the site from an analysis standpoint and look at opportunities and constraints. Certainly the site is located in an advantageous location along the I-65 corridor, which has been a traditional growth corridor for the Nashville MSA, predominantly from an office and residential perspective to the south into Williamson County. Also has easy access to I-440 and the Nashville International Airport. It's located within a close proximity to a number of emerging or existing neighborhoods such as Sobro, 12 South, 100 Oaks. Of course, you've got Trevecca University, Belmont University, the new convention center. So there are a lot of things in close proximity. It's kind of wrapped by emerging development as well. There's easy access to the central business district and that convention center. Some of the constraints we identified is, as you may be aware, there are needed improvements at the Wedgwood intersection of I-65. There's different level of improvements. Those improvements are needed whether the redevelopment in a mixed-use fashion happens at the site or whether it happens as a fairgrounds use or whether none of that happens. That intersection and interchange needs some level of improvements. There are some light industrial uses in close proximity, and when you talk about opportunities for mixed-use redevelopment, those can be constraints from a view and a pollution standpoint. at-grade railroad crossings. We'll touch on those in just a second. And then the site in general needs infrastructure improvements. As we zoom in a little bit and look at site access, again, you've got immediate access to 2 major highways, which is a major plus for the site. You've also got access to transit routes, which in terms of office users, that's an important factor that they consider when they're looking at locations for their potential office. The 3 at-grade railroad crossings, which are circled here in orange. I should mention, if you're trying to follow along in the booklet will not follow this PowerPoint precisely, but you can kind of, the general flow is the same, so you may not see the exact image, but a lot of the bullet points are highlighted here. And then it's got sidewalk connections and a future greenway plan through the site. So from a pedestrian, a vehicular, and a transit perspective, the site is very well positioned. As we examine the site a little closer, now we're looking at the physical fairground site itself, and we're looking at what might be opportunities or what might be detriments to potential development. And the first thing that pops out is the area in the yellow, which I know was talked about a little bit last week, which is floodway and floodway buffer, which essentially for development moving forward would be deemed undevelopable from a private sector. In addition to that, there's some floodplain along the fringes, which can be developed in, but does have some limitations. The yellow jagged edges represent steep slopes from a redevelopment perspective, something that would have to be dealt with. And then most notably, elevation change. And I know most of you are familiar with this site, but from the high point on the site or the plateau to the low point of the track, there's about 50 foot of elevation change there. That would have to be dealt with in terms of redevelopment and as you develop the site and improve infrastructure. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Pam Yonkin to talk a little bit about our approach on the market demand study and get into the details of the study itself.
All right. Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me get the clicker. Actually.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. We did a couple different things to get started on this. A lot of it is to review some of the plans that have already been put together, and also to look at what kinds of data are out there and available for Nashville and also the greater metro area. We examined some Collier's data and some other real estate professional data sources that provide information on vacancy rates and absorption and things along those lines. We looked at some of the ULI's previous plans and also NAIOP information. And that sort of provided the information for the market analysis piece of the study that we did. The second part of the study was actually focusing on the economic impacts that might be generated by a mixed-use development at the Fairgrounds site. And for that, we relied on slightly different data sources. There's a modeling approach that comes out of Minnesota. Actually, it's called the in-plan model, and that's what we use to try to generate the economic impacts. The Planner's Estimating Guide gave us some information about what might be the square footage requirements for an employee, and Energy Star supported that. BLS and U.S. Census Bureau provided us some information on the demographics and economic picture of Nashville, and then also the metropolitan statistical area, which includes the 13 counties surrounding. So our approach was basically to use the data we could get our hands on and synthesize it, try to figure out what it all meant for Nashville-Davidson County. And of particular interest to us were the things like vacancy rates and what's the absorption over time, and it's rather variable, so we needed to go back quite a ways. And then also to get a sense of what's the existing population and economic growth that are anticipated for both the city and then also the greater metro area. One of the things we did, because there's a lot of uncertainty involved in these sorts of analyses, is we used a risk approach, which means that we can check out the highs and the lows and factor in all that sort of information in our modeling so that we can actually bring into the results the uncertainty that's associated with any kind of development. And what we used all that information to do is to come up with a share of overall market demand that could be supplied by the proposed Fairgrounds site. So we had some key assumptions, one of which is that when we talked about institutional, we assumed that 15% of the office development would basically be comprised of institutional users. For vacancy rates, when it came to the institutional user, we assumed the same as we did for office, which was between 7 and 10%. And my understanding is, I guess, for Q4 of 2012, it's about 8.4%. So that's pretty much right in the middle of the range. So that was an assumption we feel real comfortable with. For the residential estimates, we used some closing information that we had and made some assumptions about how big those units might be. And then we assigned a value to them and figured out, kind of talked to different people and got a sense that maybe the residential demand might be about 5 to 25% of total Nashville, Davidson County demand. And all of this information was used in our modeling. Just to kind of back up a little bit, there's a couple of things that are sort of interesting about just the general existing conditions information we were able to assemble for the area. First of all, the metropolitan statistical area, which is the MSA number, is booming. And if you look at the Nashville-Davidson balance, which is basically metro, it's pretty much consistent with the US. And so when we looked at this, we thought that was pretty interesting because it suggests that there's demand out there, a lot of people moving in, but the city may not be capturing as much of that population growth as the greater area. Similar to employment, Nashville is doing fine, but their average annual employment growth is a little under 1%, but the MSA generally is doing a little bit bigger. And again, it points to opportunities in our perspective. So this first figure shows you what the Nashville residential market demand was that we estimated, and it's about 70,000 units by 2025. We anticipate about 68% of the demand is for single-family units in Nashville. And to come up with these numbers, we used the annual population growth range of between -1% and 2%. So we tried to factor in a little bit of flexibility there. Now, when we look at the Fairgrounds residential market demand, we thought a little bit about that, and we assume that 35% of the demand for fairground space, in other words, if we build residences in the fairground space, about 35% of that will be for single-family units. We're anticipating more multifamily units in the fairgrounds area just because of the nature of the location, the neighborhoods that surround it, and then just generally what we think the demand is for that area of town. This means that you sort of look at the numbers, we wind up with a little bit over, about 3,200 is our high estimate for what we think the number of units would be by 2025. The low estimate is a little bit over 1,500. Of that, about 1,100 to 2,150 would probably be multifamily units based on the analysis we did. Now, the other side of the equation is the non-residential demand. And in Nashville, retail can be a little bit flexible, so we had a range of between -9% and 5% in terms of growth annually. Our office growth is still a little bit flexible, -6% to about 8%, and then institutional we assumed was about -1% to 0.7%. And the point of those ranges is just to try to capture some of the uncertainty that's associated with this kind of estimates. If you look at the figure, that sort of translates to, in Nashville, about, for office space, you're looking at a little under about 6.8 million square feet by 2025, and a little bit over 1 million for the institutional, and slightly less than 500,000 for retail. And this is for Nashville overall. We then took that information and winnowed it down to the Fairgrounds development that we anticipate for office. And you can kind of see, this is a little bit of a confusing chart, but it's got a ton of information on it. If you look at the bars, the high and the low bars for each type of use are next to each other. So if you look at 2025, the low office estimate is a little bit over 400,000, between 400 and 500,000. The high for office is about 1.7. Thanks, John. And then you can kind of continue to go to the right. The next two bars will give you a sense of the institutional demand range that we estimated, and then finally the retail. And just generally overall, we're anticipating the development by 2025 would be between 450,000 square feet to about 1.6 million. Now I'm going to hand it over and let John talk a little bit about how that information went into actually developing the program.
So that was the initial analysis and also the initial demand study to see what is the market, what is the potential market demand as we look out 10 years into the future, into 2025. we took that demand and coupled it with the site analysis. So looking at the physical site, if you put these things two together, would all of that demand fit on the site? There's probably a scenario where it would, but again, going back to the neighborhood conversations, neighborhood input, stakeholder input, that would create a site that is too intense, too dense, that the neighborhood would be comfortable with, and that maybe larger Nashville would be comfortable with. So what we did was take the market demand range, which are the numbers at the top. So you see the market demand says that the Fairgrounds site could absorb 1,700 to 3,300 residential units. What we use for a development range when we go to program the site and physically design the site is a range of 500 to 900 units. So, you know, a little less than a third of what the demand says we're saying could be satisfied in the Fairgrounds. Same thing from a retail perspective. The range is a little bit different. It's 50 to 150,000, where the demand says 25 to 100. Remember, we're talking about several assumptions and different growths, but we're also factoring that into the development pattern that the neighborhood has expressed they would like to see, neighborhood retail, village-centered style of development. So we can accommodate that within the range as we move forward. Office, again, 750,000 to 1.5 million. We adjust that range a little bit to express what the site can handle. And the same thing for civic, that we don't think the proper civic mix would be 325,000 square feet on this site, that the site has more value than what that might generate. So how do you get there? How do you get to that development program? And what we are suggesting is that what happens and what you do first is you set the table. You basically, assuming that you move forward with a mixed-use development, you provide infrastructure, you improve some of those issues that we talked about in the site analysis, such as site access. Here, what we're proposing is that Bransford and Rains Avenue become connected through an extension of Rains Avenue down to where Bransford currently curls off. That would give you a direct connection all the way to 100 Oaks. Improvements to Wedgewood all the way from the interchange to the Fairgrounds site. Those are streetscape, benches, sidewalks, site lighting improvements. Same thing for Nolensville from the 440 exit down to where it connects to 4th Avenue. Those would get those same improvements: streetscape, site lighting, street trees, visual and aesthetic improvements. For the most part, the infrastructure that's in place from a traffic perspective will satisfy future needs, with the exception of some additional turn lanes where Wedgewood is extended, and the same thing along Wedgewood where this intersection would occur. But otherwise, the roadway width and infrastructure would handle projected traffic. In addition to this, we would upgrade the utility infrastructure. So with those roadway improvements, accommodate upgrades in the utilities, water, electric, sewer. We're also suggesting that with these roads, it's kind of difficult to see on screen, but there is one large parking structure here and another parking structure here, and then two civic institutional buildings go in along with plus or minus 45 acres of park improvements. So that essentially is the development for the site, that you put the infrastructure in for the site and let private development come in and infill on that infrastructure with their own dollars. So as we break that down just a little bit, you get a little bit closer look at the Fairgrounds site. You see a street network, a fairly regimented, gridded street network that provides connections off to the site, begins to address additional access points to the site off of Craighead. See the larger parking garage, which would go into place, which would somewhat address the slope issues, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And then these institutional buildings, one of the things that we heard repeatedly and we saw repeatedly within those previous documents that we reviewed, that if the site were going to be redeveloped to try to accommodate in some way, some form or fashion of expo or flexible vendor space, we think those spaces could be accommodated within the mixed-use development plan in this location. So in general, you see a list of improvements that would be included in what we call the site framework plan, which is essentially set the table for private development. The second step you would go about in terms of developing the plan is what we call sub-area plan, or essentially put a design overlay on that framework plan. You know, there's a couple of ways if you determine that the site was capable and that you wanted to move forward with a mixed-use development, you could certainly sell the entire property to one developer, but you would lose control. You would lose design control. You would also lose timing control. One of the things that the framework does is incentivize private development to happen sooner. The sub-area plan gives you design controls where you can, within each of these defined sub-areas, begin to establish what land uses can exist there, architectural controls such as building massing, height, parking requirements, open space requirements, sustainability requirements. But the sub-area plan begins to allow you to address some of those design issues. And I just want to walk through them real quick, some of the things we might suggest if you were moving forward and some of the things we considered. So sub-area A and B is on the, I guess it's the western border. This is Bransford here. And what we're proposing is transitional zones. So adjacent to those single-family homes and duplexes, which are along Bransford, and then the larger community, that those areas be two-story, limited to two-story residential structures. They might be attached, they could be detached, but it could be townhomes. And then as you move to the Bransford extension, density and height begins to increase, where those become a three-story maximum mixed use with retail/office, commercial uses on the first floor and residential above. And then as you move further into the site, those intensities and densities increase. But this sub-area plan would give you those design controls to begin to talk about character, which is mentioned in just about every document when you look at redevelopment for the fairgrounds, to be natural to the neighborhood and not to redefine the character, drop something in that isn't reflective of the character of the neighborhood. The other thing that you'd want to address here that we can talk about is increased parking ratios. So in some of these areas that are in close proximity to surrounding neighborhoods, where some areas like 12 South, for instance, that have had redevelopment happen on 12 South, they've actually had, in some cases, reduced parking ratios. It's causing friction between the existing neighborhood and the retailers and merchants. So we can look to try to get out in front of that with a sub-area plan and say that if you're in close proximity to some of these residential neighborhoods on the fringes, you might be required to do increased parking ratios. The next sub-area is sub-area C and D, and this is where we get into the core of the site, and this is where our predominant density is located. So it's protected somewhat by the site itself by green space and lower intensity uses, and that is where your higher density residential would be. Again, we propose limiting it to a 4-story maximum. Within those sites, there would be open space requirements. We would also talk about that a certain number of spaces have to be provided through structured parking. Again, that's one way to control development form and function. As you move into sub-area D, then we began to say this is a sort of, again, a transitional site within the site itself where there's an opportunity to mix commercial and office. So that could potentially be one of the first development sites because it sits on top of a parking structure, which would be provided with the infrastructure or framework plan. With utilities available, it becomes an attractive site, so certainly an opportunity there. Again, we're looking at maximum heights for both parking structures and buildings, architectural controls. When you get into sub-area E, that becomes the office campus, which is essentially down where the existing stadium seats are and the existing racetrack is. So we take that area where it has the most flexibility on site. We've provided some infrastructure around the perimeter, but you really let the private market control the form and function, and you'll see here in a moment we've got several options on how that could happen. But again, you're looking at height restrictions, building size restrictions, parking restrictions, so that you may not allow, if a user wanted to come in and say, I wanted to build 500,000 square foot of office, you wouldn't necessarily want them allowed to surface park that entire area initially, because we want to try to maintain green space, again, one of the neighborhood concerns. So you try to address those concerns with this sub-area plan. F and G is along the Wedgewood extension, very similar uses to the Rains-Bransford connection, where you're looking at 3-story maximum. The sub-area G, which is the expo / civic / institutional use, we envision that building as being a flex building, almost like a sort of farmer's market type building that has flexible vending spaces below that can be maybe occupied on a permanent basis, but also on a temporary basis. Those buildings spill out onto green spaces. We'll show you a sketch here in a minute of what that could mean. Could even have residential on top, artist lofts, those types of things. And then lastly is the park space. I may have neglected to mention, but the sub-area plan allows for a little over 45 acres of open space on the site, which is about a little over 40% of the site in green space. We think you could accommodate that with the sub-area plans. It would begin to drive how much open space the site has, but certainly along the floodway and the floodway fringe. But some of the uses that has been talked about, there may be opportunities to recreate some of the nostalgia of the past with some recreational amenities that have been put in place in other parks throughout the country. A small amphitheater has been talked about through a number of studies, and certainly was demonstrated in our open house. Public art as well, and again, those temporary vendor locations, that those areas could easily accommodate those types of uses. So what does that look like when you combine the framework plan with the sub-area plan? And this is our illustrative master plan. You can see again a development range, and this was the development range which was derived at through the site analysis and the market demand study. And this is a real-world plan with actual building footprints, parking ratios, parking requirements, street widths. Again, as I said, we've approached this site as if we were performing this study for a private developer, so they are real-world yield studies. This particular study yields a little over 1 million square feet of office, 119,000 square foot of retail, 50,000 square foot of institutional civic space, 883 residential units, and it also includes a 90-room hotel down here in the lower area. This is the institutional space. That 50,000 encompasses the first floor under this scenario with residential units above it on the second floor. The main core of that office square footage of that 1 million square feet, about 750 to 800,000 of it is encompassed in these 6 buildings. These 6 buildings, 2 of these are sitting on top of structured parking in the lower area, and then of course you've got a structured parking here. Transition uses of the townhomes connecting to the exterior boundary of the site in the residential neighborhoods. Then of course Bransford Extended, which begins to establish a village feel with retail commercial uses on the first floor, residential above, which leads to this core of the site, or the village portion of the site, with a public plaza that overlooks the office, and retail stores below residential in this location. As I mentioned, the framework plan would allow for a number of alternatives. One of the things that's important if you're going to do a framework plan is that it's flexible. It's flexible to allow the private sector to determine their development patterns and development techniques. So by installing the infrastructure of Bransford and then a connector to Old Bransford, it basically, within that infrastructure, there's several different ways. You could actually do additional attached product with sort of a wrap product with a structured parking involved, and then along Bransford it more or less stays the same. Maybe you switch some of that mixed use to just pure residential, but again, that would be up to the private development sector once the infrastructure is in place. As you move into the residential core, the core kind of stays the same in this scenario, but you can see how the office can look different within this framework, whether it's a wider plaza or a smaller plaza, whether it becomes 4 individual, more flexible, traditional office buildings, office footprints, or more of an urban wrap type product with a smaller dimension. These buildings tend to be more flexible, so depending on the developer, depending on when the developer would build those buildings, it may determine what size and shape they are. The important thing is that under each of those alternatives, the site parks, the site functions, the infrastructure that's in place allows for those development patterns. And then maybe more importantly, in the office campus portion of the site, same type of thing. This is essentially the lower bowl of the existing racetrack, but several different ways that could happen and give you the same yield of 800 to 1 million square feet of office within that bowl. And the design guidelines or the sub-area plan would drive a scenario here where you've got buildings that are 4 stories high sitting on top of a 4-story parking garage, or a scenario such as this where you might have a combination where some of the buildings are on top of a parking garage, others are not, or lastly, 4 individual buildings with parking structures, separate parking structures. All of that could function. Certainly the sub-area plan, you might want to give bonus densities or might have some incentives for trying to do structured parking with buildings over top because of the way it functions within the plan. So coming back to how that looks again, the yield, as I said, even though there's multiple alternatives within this framework plan, they will all fall within that development range. So what we wanted to make sure is we developed a framework plan, and one of the reasons why we did multiple studies and showed you those alternatives are there are more than one way for this site to develop, but we're very confident that however it develops, it would fall within that development range. So when we talk about economic impact, these are the actual numbers we're using in our economic impact. So how might that look? I know sometimes it's hard to visualize from a plan view. This is a view from above Bransford looking towards the existing racetrack. And you can see here the bowl of the racetrack, or if you remember from our analysis, there's an elevation change from this point to the lower point of the racetrack of about 50 feet. What we had proposed here is that 50 feet, the predominant amount of that 50 feet is taken up by that structured parking. So that's the office first floor is essentially 4 stories in the air down in the bowl, which continues that pedestrian connection, but also gives corporate office users potential detachment from the rest of the community on a daily basis from a vehicular standpoint, but on a pedestrian standpoint, it provides a strong connection to the rest of the neighborhood, which would be necessary for this area and to have restaurants, shops, coffee shops. You would need that connection to that much office for those to function properly. This next view is looking from Craighead towards that parking deck. This is the old racetrack area. You can see what under these scenarios we propose that the slopes on the exterior of the racetrack stay in place. So even these are 8-story buildings, you really only visually see 4 stories above those racetrack banks approximately. You also, along this entire edge, southern and southeastern edge, have this green ribbon which flows into the site, and you can see that grade change right in here. That's that 4-story parking garage down below. And then lastly, as we move over and look at the civic institutional side, one of the things that we heard repeatedly, and it's demonstrated repeatedly in the previous documents, and it also shone through in our public meeting, was if there was a way to at least allude to some historic buildings on site, and certainly these civic institutional buildings could do that. Maybe even the hotel could begin to look like the old women's building that was on the fairgrounds. You've got the old Coliseum and certainly a facade treatment. But it's a way to at least recognize the past uses if you do redevelop the site, and certainly the sub-area plan could begin to encourage that. And even something like a carousel just might suggest those activities that took place there previously, that maybe it's redeveloped in such a way that those uses and those activities can still happen. Again, here's the big lawn out in front of that institutional/expo space, but we see that lawn as an extension of that 50,000 square feet where you could up and down the street, close down the street, and have vendors up and down the street and into the lawn areas, which essentially spills out into 40 acres of green space that surrounds the site. So what does all that cost? What we put a cost to was the framework plan, because again, what we are suggesting is that public infrastructure is put in place essentially through public funds. The infrastructure or framework plan is built. After that, it would be private developer dollars that see the vision through. So that includes this, the 1,200 spaces on Garage A in the center of the site, the 250 space garage near the Expo Civic Institutional Building, and then all the lineal foot of roadway and the utilities associated with that, including stormwater quality, and the park improvements. So we worked very closely with a couple of our team members, RPM Transportation, in developing the roadway widths and roadway sections. And then we went to professional cost estimators, Conoco Inc., which are construction cost estimators, very familiar with the market, work extensively in this market to put direct costs to the project. And here's what that yield is. Essentially, the total with project contingencies. On the bottom, the project costs, those are soft costs, which include fixtures, furnishings, benches, site furniture on site, fees, which are development fees, testing, and then a project contingency. The total is about $76 million, with the majority of that cost being in the 4 structures. The largest being the parking garage of $20 million, which accommodates 1,200 cars. But again, one of the things that we hear repeatedly when we're talking about office development, particularly in the urban Nashville market, is the lack of parking. This is one way to overcome that and make it very prevalent right off the bat that you've got a site with parking that exists today with utilities. It will help to attract, help to compete in the larger Nashville metro market. So we think those garages are important. Certainly, not all of it has to be built in order for development to happen, but we think that all of it would encourage development to happen in a quicker fashion and make the site more attractive as a whole from the get-go, particularly with the park improvements. And I will just add, this is happening from a private sector standpoint in Williamson County right now in Cool Springs, where a developer is building infrastructure for roughly 1.2 million square feet of development. He's investing $10 million in private funds to build a park before he has one user signed up. He's also putting his roadways in. He's put development. So it's a very competitive site for that environment, and it's even got additional pluses where he's talking about a 10-acre park. We're talking about a 45-acre park. So it becomes competitive on the larger marketplace with this infrastructure in place. I'm going to kick it back to Pamela here for a moment to talk about the impact of those costs and that infrastructure.
Try to turn here. Okay, so we basically thought about economic impacts in a couple of different ways, and I'll describe each of the different ways we thought about it as we get farther along in the presentation. But just to kind of reiterate, we used what's considered a nationally recognized economic impact model called IMPLAN to estimate jobs, wages, and output. And when we say output, we're sort of thinking about sales. One of the things we did is evaluate both what the construction impacts would be, in other words, what the short-term impacts be to the Nashville area if you were to build some of these things, and then also what would be the longer-term impacts generated by private developers going in, developing the site, and then having businesses be there. So there's three, can I borrow the?
Oh,
Yeah. There's three different impacts that we measured. This first one, this infrastructure investment generated impacts, what that is when there's a decision made, if there's a decision made to actually build the infrastructure that would be required to support private development. In other words, some of these parking structures, some of the roadway improvements, the utility improvements, these are the impacts we think would be generated by that investment. So for that 76 million or so, we're estimating that the total sales would be about 85.6 million. Looking at jobs, it would be a total jobs of 550 jobs associated with just the construction of that infrastructure that we feel would be help make the site more marketable. The second column is actually if we were to, if a private developer comes in and they decide to build buildings that will accommodate people's residences, but also businesses, these are the construction generated impacts that we would estimate. Now, we would think that that might take about 10 years to happen. So this column shows you the annual average of those impacts. So what we're saying is between the time 2015 to 2024, we would expect about 45 million in sales and about 305 total jobs. And when I talk about total jobs, I mean jobs that are actually on the Fairgrounds site, but also the jobs that are supported by people doing things like buying their lunch in other parts of Nashville off the Fairgrounds site. So that includes both what we call the direct jobs of people employed at the site, but then also some of the multiplier effects or spillover effects due to those people being there. The third column is actually once everything's in place and once businesses come into the Fairgrounds site and start occupying the space and people move in and live there, what would we expect the annual economic impact to be from those operational uses? In other words, if company comes in, people are working there, they go out for lunch, they come back, they spend their wages on their housing perhaps and other things related to them being there. And we would estimate that, we did estimate it to be about 600 million in sales, about total personal income of about 187 million, and then about 3,840 jobs at full build out. In other words, in 2025, we would expect that there would be about 3,840 jobs supported by the development that's occurred at the Fairgrounds. One of the things I do want to point out is that this probably underestimates what the true impact would be. The second column right here only focuses on the construction impacts. In other words, when the buildings get built on the site, it's just those construction impacts that we estimate. We don't include the fact that those buildings might come on at any point between 2015 and 2024. So those businesses might actually start hiring people and residences may be built and people living in there sometime between 2015 and 2024, but we don't include that in our estimates. We wanted to err on the conservative side. Now, an additional benefit to the mixed-use development would be the tax revenue that would accrue to Metro. We looked only at two types of tax revenue, property tax revenue and sales revenue, that would be generated by the three different categories of investment. So, for example, we would estimate that about $1.5 million in property and sales tax would be generated by the building of the infrastructure at the Fairgrounds to support the private development. In other words, the parking garage being built, the roadways being improved, the utilities being put in place. We would expect another $800,000 per year between 2015 and 2024 that is related to the buildings that are being put there. In other words, a private developer commits, they're going to build a building. There's construction costs, materials, labor, those sorts of things. The economic impact that's generated by that construction activity is about $800,000 per year for this 10-year period. And then the last one, once everything's in place, from 2025 on, we would estimate about $5 million in tax revenue accruing to Metro each year. And that includes, well, one thing I'll say is this is property tax revenue, but also sales tax revenue, but it only is calculated on the structures. It doesn't include the land value and the property taxes that would be paid on the land that supports those structures. And then John's going to do a little bit of the comparison of the two, Phase 1 and Phase 2 plan.
Thank you, Pam. As I mentioned earlier, we worked very closely, particularly on these next two slides, and even examining how we measured economic impact with the Phase 1 team, because even though the uses are inherently different, there are some impacts which you can associate with both projects. So we wanted to make sure that Phase 1 team, again, used the same in-plan modeling that we used. We used the same census data. And in terms of what they measured in terms of tax impacts, direct impacts to Metro, that we measured the same thing from a private development, mixed-use development plan. So looking at the two projects together, I will say if you'd like to flip to page, if you've got your booklet, I believe it's page 53 that has both of the projects. Thank you, Councilman. So you can see what we're comparing in terms of the Phase 3B. We were asked to compare the best practices scenario, and as the Phase 1 team mentioned last week, that the best practices scenario did not include the racetrack. So that's the dollars and the comparison that we've used here. For those of you that would like to see it, we did include in the appendix to this document this same comparison with the racetrack model. So it's in the appendix, but for our purposes today, we're using the ones without the racetrack. And you can see the cost to redevelopment per Phase 1 is $143 million for scenario 3B. For the mixed-use development, $76.2 million. That would generate an additional impact of an investment from a private side of $246 million. That is the value of structures that are built. So the 1 million square feet of office, the 870 some residential units, that would total an additional investment on the site of about $246 million. In terms of annual impacts, the comparison in terms of total personal earnings from folks working on the site, $12 million for the Fairgrounds scenario, roughly $187 million once the site is completely built out for the mixed-use scenario. Total sales, again, as Pamela mentioned, those total sales include not just sales on site, but sales connected to the Fairgrounds. And again, the total sales for Phase 1 were calculated the same way. If you recall, they're referring to in tax revenue, looking at vehicle rental, hotel taxes. Phase 3B didn't include those uses on the Fairgrounds site, but they're accounting for taxes that are garnered through folks visiting the Fairgrounds site. So we compared similar things. However, we didn't capture hotel taxes. We didn't capture vehicle rental taxes, although those things would certainly take place. We looked at more direct sales tax, and it's roughly $300,000 annually generated from that approximately 100,000 square foot of retail. But the big difference is here. So if you looked at the total of the site, if the Fairgrounds were redeveloped for $143 million in terms of the best practices, it would require a subsidy of approximately $400,000 annually. It would generate taxes to Metro of $777,000, which is a net revenue of roughly $370,000 annually. The Fairgrounds site, if redeveloped, would cost $76.2 million and would generate, in terms of local taxes, $5.2 million. $4.9 million of that is property tax annually. Now that is, I want to talk about the assumptions and how that was arrived at. As Pamela mentioned, that is for the structures only. So the value of structures, which were determined by square footage with a market rate construction cost, and then gone through the tax assessor's formula. And Waddell can certainly speak to that, and that's in the appendix as well. So you can see within this Excel spreadsheet how that number was derived at. The one thing I want to point out is we didn't include it within the comparison chart, but it should be considered that one thing that if you redevelop the site as a mixed-use site, a major difference is you then have land to sell to the private sector. we went through some land cost comparisons, which again are also in the appendix, but established a value, a very conservative value of $21 a square foot for price of land once the infrastructure improvements are in place. That would result in a value to Metro of about $55 million. So one way to recapture the infrastructure costs would be through the sale of that land. In addition, if you assume the land is valued at $21 a square foot, it would generate an additional $1 million in property taxes annually. So that number could be up around 6.2. There is a huge disparity in the market in terms of comparable sales numbers for land, because there's not a site that exists in Nashville that might have 100 developable acres on it with infrastructure. You'll see, once you review the appendix, you can see that the range in close proximity is anywhere from, I think, $14 a square foot. Now that is undeveloped land without infrastructure, up to $180 a square foot, I think is our highest, which is in the fringes of the Sobro area, I believe. So $21 we feel is a sort of ultra conservative number to establish for a land value. And last but certainly not least, as we mentioned, if the fairgrounds is redeveloped as part of the Phase 1 best practices, you're looking at 308 full and part-time jobs, service-oriented jobs, versus 3,840 full-time jobs on site generated from the mixed-use plan. I believe that concludes our presentation. We'll be happy at this point, according to the chair, to answer any questions.
Thank you, John. Council Lady Moore.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the recognition, and thank you, Mr. Haas and your team, for especially the math part of it, because I'm still sitting here saying I may need to go back over this. But I just have two quick questions. I did look at page 39, and I was like wondering about Browns Creek. When I looked at page 40, I was just trying to find at the illustrated master plan on page 40, where is that located on there?
Let me go back, because I can refer to it on this plan.
That's
you see the sort of fuzzy green? It's along that. This is it right here. So it stays in its current location, and actually part of the, if you look at the cost, I think we allocated roughly $7.5 million for park improvements. That creek is on I believe on an endangered list of some sort. It would have to be restored, so that would be included in the cost of the framework plan.
And what part of the campus was the fair? I didn't see that. I was trying to see where the fair was.
The expo sort of vendor, that's down here in the corner along Nolensville and the Wedgwood extension.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And that green space would spill out into the larger green space, so this area.
Okay. Well, that's all. If I got any more, I know Ann is leaving, but I know Jennifer Carlott is around, so if I got more questions, I'll do that. Or Tim, or Buck. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council Lady. Are there any more questions from council members? Councilman Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The appendix, section 8, you said that's available. It's not in the packet. Do you have that with you?
We do have hard copies. We've got limited hard copies with us. It's also available electronically. That I think that will be posted.
Right.
In the morning, we'll post both the
You can use the mic.
I can't hear you, Ann.
In the morning, we'll post the presentation, the electronic copy of the full report, and an electronic copy of the appendix.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm going to send the council links to all of those postings.
Thank you, ma'am.
Councilman Member Dowell, Councilmember Dominic.
I got a little taller than Ms. Dowell, but I had a couple of questions. You indicated the cost of the setting the table is the term you used. Does that include the demolition of the existing site in order to prepare the road infrastructure and other things? And if not, what is the cost of that, and how did you calculate it?
It is included, along with we also included proposed earthwork utility infrastructure. Some of those testing numbers accounted for additional environmental testing for the site, so it is included as part of that infrastructure.
Another thing, you commented that the master plan phase 1 indicated that the best practices did not include a racetrack. If you go back and read that, it actually states a paved racetrack was not the best practices rather than racing itself. In fact, 42% of all the fairgrounds across the country include a racetrack of some sort. Only 2 of those include a paved racetrack, which is actually an upgrade to racing. So I want to be clear, make that statement, that statement has been made that it's not best practices, but yet 42% of the fairgrounds across the country include a racetrack of some sort.
You are correct, and thank you for correcting. It did say paved racetrack. Now, I will point out that in terms of the comparison, it doesn't make a big difference in terms of the comparison, whether there's a racetrack there or not, with the economic impact in terms of the comparison chart. And again, just so everyone can see that for themselves, it's included in the appendix.
Well, I'll be looking forward to seeing the appendix, because that's been mentioned multiple times during different presentations, but as of today, it's not been made available to us. And so it's difficult for us to ask questions about that appendix and how that might impact our decision. So I look forward to getting that, and hopefully we'd have an opportunity to come back and ask those questions to you, since you helped put them together in a formal setting, because we don't have that data to review currently.
Yes.
The other thing you indicated, if we redevelop the fairgrounds as a fairgrounds, they would only generate 308 jobs. How can you explain that when we have 1,700 vendors participating in just our flea market alone?
Sir, I'm not in a position to explain that. That is from the phase 1 team, taken directly from their data that was reported.
Well, that needs to be answered, because it's a claim that falls way short of the current vendors at just our flea market. That doesn't include those that put on the displays at the Lawn and Garden Show, which is taking place later this week. I encourage everybody to go by and see. And I know a number of those companies that do all of their marketing and their promotion advertising for the year is done during the Lawn and Garden Show. Now, those are indirect jobs created from the fairgrounds, and the marketing for those companies are done on site. And so the 308 seems woefully inadequate to be accurate. That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Councilmember Dominic. Councilmember Claiborne.
Thank you. You said you had limited numbers of the appendix. What are those limited numbers?
I've got one copy right up here. I'll be happy to hand it to you.
Okay, so
we've got another copy, I believe, and
well,
we might have 2 copies.
The point of my question is there are 10 of us here. Is your limited number doesn't go that high? Okay, thank
I hear you. It doesn't, but you're welcome. If you, I mean, we can hand them out right now if you'd like to see it. If anyone would like to see it right now, we'll be here. Certainly, if you'd like to review it, if that's. Do you got another one?
All right, Councilman Claiborne, does that conclude your question? Any other questions from council members? All right, seeing none, we'll have some comments from Mr. Dozier. I'm sorry.
Very briefly, thank you, Mr. Chair. Remind all of you that our staff commits to you during the process. Whenever that process is determined and begins, our staff will be available to you to answer questions. Hopefully, if you have not had a tour of the fairgrounds, to make sure you do that. We'll put you on a golf cart. I want you to see the entire facility and the grounds, so you can have a better idea what you're talking about at that time. Third, and I'm not going to speak for Tim, but I must commend Ann Hammonds. She is leaving in 2 days from Metro Government. If it wasn't for Ann Hammonds keeping Tim and I abreast of everything and in the right direction, and our consultants as well, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. This is my first time to work with her. I used to sit over there, and used to sit right here. And I knew you, but I didn't know you. But it's been a total privilege to work with you, and she's just a total professional person. And unfortunately, she told me she was going to leave right after this was done. I did not know that that would be 2 days apart from the time that it ended and to the time she leaves. So Tim and I, we're kind of left here, but we'll make it through it. Ann, thank you so much. Mr. Chair, thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Dozier, and also thank you to Ms. Hammonds in lieu of her retirement that is on the horizon. Sorry. We do have some council members that have chimed in as Mr. Dozier was speaking, and I will afford them the opportunity. Council Member Pardue.
Yeah, this is for you, Buck. Can you tell me what year we decided to quit spending money on the fairground as far as the upkeep?
Actually, when I got there, they were not spending any money because the reserve funds, they had about $8 million at one time in reserves, and they spent about $6 million on ADA requirements and sprinklers. And at the same time that happened, their revenues, they lost fanfare, they lost racing went down, and so there was the perfect storm. They spent a lot of money, and then they began to lose a lot of money. And when I got there, they were bleeding pretty much about over $1 million a year. We've cut that down almost to $300,000. So we, under, I think, duress, the fact that we have a black cloud over us. But the capital improvements, we don't have a capital improvement budget at all. And so whatever the fairgrounds had over the years to fix came out of their revenues. And again, I explained to you the loss of those. And so we have not been able to do anything. And then with closing, actually, they told us General Services was going to take us over when we were closing the first time, and they would, all the buildings and everything would go to General Services. Of course, we got a reprieve twice to stay open, and we have not, the budget we have now really has no money for improvements, zero. And we are holding our breath that we're not going to have a major air conditioning, heating unit go down out there. It is an old facility that needs a lot of work. But I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Councilman Claiborne.
Yes, I'd like to address this request to Chairman Pridemore. If you would consider getting with Mr. Dozier and identifying at least 2, maybe 3 different dates that council members could opt in to go and take the tour that he's offering to us. I don't know if you'd want to have everybody at the same time. I don't know that you'd ever get everybody at the same time, but to have at least a couple of options, if that would be something you'd consider doing. And then I'd just like to take the personal privilege to also extend my congratulations to Ms. Hammond, and also to thank her for all of her service to the city and the work that she's done with the council in the time that I've been here since 2007. She's been a great help to me, and I'm sure to others that were new to the council when I came in, and to those of you that are new now. If you haven't had a chance to work with her, you missed a great opportunity. So thank you, Ms. Ann, and we will certainly miss you, but wish you well as you go on the dog show route and traveling and wherever you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Claiborne. Councilman Pridemore?
Well, in response to Councilman Claiborne's question, yes, we request. That's certainly an option, and we'll, if there is some council members that like to do that, I'll get with Director Dozier and see if we can arrange something. Also, I think Council Lady Moore and I have discussed, and Matthews have discussed possibly having some more meetings concerning this with later during the process to inform more of the council members that were unable to attend this afternoon. So that would definitely. I have one question real quick for the the team. All this information has has come from the request from the open house, the input from the public at the open house? I mean, this is a result of their input. Is that correct?
The information has been influenced as a result of their input. The program was derived at through the council bill, which specifically said study the site for a mix of uses that include residential, retail, office. We took the market demand and started there, and then part of the site analysis and neighborhood input were, if the site were to develop as a mixed use, would you be concerned? And that's where they expressed concerns about building height, the size of buildings, transitional uses along the edges. So yeah, it certainly respects their input if the site develops as a mixed use.
Okay, thank you. And I too want to thank you for your work. And also, Ms. Hammonds, as we say in the police department, you finished on top. You've solved the big case on your way out. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilman Pridemore. As Chair of Budget and Finance, I certainly would like to thank everyone for their participation, especially our presenters today, Tim, Mr. Dozier, Ms. Hammond. We thank you all for the work that you've put in, and any staff that may have worked with you from your respective departments. To all the council members, I have spoken with Council Member Pridemore, and we would like to begin this process with a conversation. I'm not certain what that looks like just now, but in my mind it looks similar to the conversation that we had that sort of started this process, where we may meet or have a just an open forum conversation for council members to just discuss next steps, possible next steps. If we have more questions after we get the full presentation sent to us, also inviting the presenters that have presented both last Thursday and today to sit in on that meeting with council members. I do hold the work that this council during this term has done with great pride. I think that we've done some good work, and I think we will continue to do so. I think this is a very big issue that is important to a lot of our constituents, and I don't want to see us continue to just keep kicking the can down the road. I do want us to make a decision on the future of this site and the future of the expo in the city, because it does have its place in the city, and I think that that's been clear through referendum. So I want to make sure that we're being very thoughtful in that decision, but I will work with Councilmember Pridemore to set at least the beginning of this process and what the next steps will look like for the council in decision making, and hopefully that will be soon before we get entrenched into our budget hearing. So that is my goal, that we're able to have some type of conversation to really decide what the process will look like. And Ms. Carlette, I'm not sure if you will be taking over Ms. Hammond's position, but I'm sure she will be available and helpful in thinking through that also. So thank you all for attending, and we will continue with regular council business next week. Thank you.